This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Amy, welcome to the Human Action Podcast.
It's so good to see you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm glad you could come. So maybe before we dive into this, because in these shows, I don't give a pre-recorded introduction, even though in some podcasts that's standard. So I think for this one, your scholarly credentials might be relevant to some listeners. So can you just briefly explain why it is that you're qualified to be talking on these matters?
Yeah, it's a good question. So first, in terms of my career, I have worked in and around emergency management for 2 decades now, serving for 2 terms as the president of the Maryland Emergency Management Association, or in the early 2000s. I based on what I saw in emergency management, I had some big burning questions. So I did end up in the doctoral program for public policy at the University of Delaware, where I explored the federal money being sent down to local emergency managers, how they interacted with that money, how the money was spent, and mostly how that money had an impact on what decisions were made for emergency management in local jurisdictions.
Okay, so that was literally the topic of your doctoral dissertation?
That's correct.
Okay, well, great. So probably in the interest of people have busy lives, let's jump into the clickbait, hot button stuff, and then maybe we'll circle around. And I do want to talk more generally about your dissertation and so forth. But I think, the burning question people have right now is, with the recent disasters, there was a lot of stuff going around on social media ranging from, oh, wow, standard bureaucratic incompetence to they're actively intervening to prevent the private sector from helping people because they just want to be in charge, and or even they don't want people to be able to go vote in red areas. So anyway, can you just take a stab at trying to calibrate people's views on that stuff? For because with all this stuff, it's hard to know, I don't even know if this footage is from this year. So it's difficult for someone who wants to who's ideologically aligned with the viewpoint that they're seeing from the post, but yet they have no way of verifying that. So anyway, can you just weigh in on those sorts of concerns?
I'm happy to do that. So just very quickly, just a brief history of FEMA, where I think we can kind of arrive at what they should be doing versus what they are doing. So, if we look back 100 years, the federal government was not involved in disaster response. It was largely handled by state government, and then as well local governments and charitable organizations, churches, charities, and the like. In the late 1970s, FEMA came under construction by the Carter administration, and the intention was to coordinate among federal agencies, but then also to coordinate between federal, state, and local governments to help facilitate that communication. And, initially, not just natural disasters were included, but also, when we were thinking about civil defense, that was housed in kind of that FEMA organization, and has morphed, now in terms of man-made hazards, FEMA absorbs some of the terrorism planning from the parent agency, Department of Homeland Security. And so there's been this merger between natural disasters and kind of man-made and technological disasters. And where we are now with FEMA, under the current director, she certainly takes on those liberal pet causes. Mm-hmm. So when people ask the questions about is there ill intent with what is going on in Appalachia and Florida? Is FEMA intentionally keeping people from voting? Are there blockades? Are there people there taking supplies that were meant instead for kind of disaster victims in that local area? It's really hard to wade through. So here's what I'm prepared to say. FEMA has been exploited over the years. And if we take a look at the training that their personnel is receiving, if we take a look at the manuals that their personnel are instructed with, it is an ideological driven organization from the director on down. She was very honest when she took the position offered to her by the Biden administration. She was clear that equity would be the most important thing that she would accomplish at FEMA. She didn't just say that, though. She made it clear by making sure that their strategic plan, which has 3 goals, equity is the first and primary goal. The second goal is climate resilience. It is not until you get to the 3rd goal in their strategic plan that there's any mention about kind of competence in emergency response. So she really she put the pedal to the metal on an equity focus. Her training for FEMA personnel has been highly focused on diversity in both the workforce, and then really thinking through how they serve a diverse community.
Can I stop you there, Amy? Just that's what I was going to ask you to unpack. Yeah. So when she says equity is like the job one with them, does that mean both like in terms of the communities they serve, and hey, let's make sure that whatever this storm doesn't have a disparate impact on the marginalized community, or does it mean the way we do hiring and promotion within the ranks of FEMA itself also should reflect cultural considerations and et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. Underneath that strategic goal 1, the initiatives have tackled both things. So It is both internal in that there should be a more diverse workforce. Now, the most recent numbers I have are from 2021, but there is a majority female that is hired at FEMA. It is like 51% female as of 2021. And then also, I think whites constructed maybe like 40% of the workforce or something less, something between 30 and 40% of the workforce. So it is an incredibly diverse workforce already, but she wants to take that even further. So those goals were certainly both internal and external. The external goals being...
Well, do they at least save on payroll because they only have to pay 78 cents for the $1 to... No.
I haven't looked that far into it. That's a good question, though.
Because that's, joking is that is one of the lines that economists often use with the male-female wage gap to say, well, if that's true, how come corporations don't just all hire all women? They, you know what I mean? Yeah. So now it's like, well, maybe this lady's saying, yes, I know, exactly, so...
Yeah, I don't think she's looking to save a couple of dollars. I'm almost positive. So you have an incredibly diverse workforce, and then they're taking these people that they hire, again, already an incredibly diverse class of folk, and they are putting them through training that really is intended to sustain a message that the biggest threat we face is white supremacy. So in 2023, during the Maui wildfires, while there were 1,000 people missing, roughly, and those fires continued to rage, there were FEMA people sitting in a classroom with an instructor telling them that, again, the biggest threat they face is white supremacy.
That's literally true. That sounds like it's a punchline.
It's not a punchline.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been documented. And that was one message from the training, right? I mean, obviously, you can imagine what is paired with that when an instructor is willing to stand up in front of a class and tell them that, as people who respond to disaster, that is their primary concern. So I want to get back to your question though. So what is actually going on? I think, part of that question can be answered by what we have seen in Florida. So there is a Florida kind of disaster response team manager. Her documentation saying that they were avoiding homes with Trump signs has been made public. And I think there was some initial speculation that this was, this is a one-off. This is not something that the, Director Quiswell is asking people to do. But this person has.
Can you, if Amy, can you clarify? So for one thing, this is a news story that was going around that it was leaked, right? That we actually saw the memo or the contents, and so it's not disputed, right? That someone at FEMA has come forward and admitted that yes, I instructed my subordinates that as they're assessing the situation, if you see a house that has a Trump sign in front of it, don't approach that house, in these affected disaster regions, right? Everybody stipulates that happened, and now we're just arguing about why and how prevalent it is?
Well, not only did that happen, but the person, the kind of the perpetrator of this document that said they should avoid homes with Trump signs has come forward. So I don't know if you've seen this yet.
I just saw the headline. She said that it's not just, was she trying to deflect blame from herself and saying, what are you talking, why is everyone getting mad at me? Like everyone does this, or it's very common?
So what she was stating is probably something they would claim is not it's not race-based. It's not actually based on politics. Her claim is that there were a couple of poor interactions with Trump supporters. Maybe they had a Trump shirt on or a Trump sign in their yard. And there was a couple of poor interactions that their approach in that area because of those interactions had to be avoidance. So this is kind of a widespread approach. She said she's not the only one. She said it goes all the way to the top. And then again, their approach is that once there is a negative interaction or two, they put these people, however they classify whatever sect of person they are seeking to avoid, they put them on kind of a list that says you don't need to interact with them. This is essentially saying that these people, because of their politics, are not deserving of the whatever resources that her disaster recovery team was working with.
So can you just give us more context so people can understand? I mean, it's not like people were just on their roofs and the water levels were up to the second story and FEMA people are going around in canoes rescuing people. It's like that the power's out or something, and so FEMA's in a neighborhood going up to houses and knocking and saying, do you guys need some bottled water? Like, is that the deal? But they were skipping houses with Trump signs? Like, what would they be approaching the house to do? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Given the damage after Milton, which was nothing in Florida, nothing like the damage wrought by Hurricane Helene in Appalachia. So the damage in Milton, I think there was structural damage. There certainly was flooding, certainly, high winds. So at this point, people may be, where are people probably in Florida who were affected? Probably patching up the roofs with tarps. They're probably, if there is still power out, and I'm not sure about that in Florida, if there is still power out, maybe there is a need for, an increased eye toward medical response. If it's like an elderly people living in the home, maybe there are maybe there is a need to do something that looks like home delivered meals. If it is a small kind of segment of the population that is affected and there aren't shelters open still. But at this point in time, those FEMA recovery teams, because we're so far from the storm and because the damage was not extensive necessarily in Milton, those recovery teams are just supposed to be checking on the homeowner. If they have, for example, filed a claim with FEMA that there was home damage or damage to their business, filed for a small business administration loan, for example, if there was damage to their small business, then they might receive a visit from a team. Those teams are not right now. Those teams are not conducting visits because there are life-threatening situations. They mostly are doing follow-up.
Okay. All right. So just to steel man the response, so the FEMA lady that, wrote that directive, and in fairness, like when you saw the memo, it was in the context of she's telling her people, hey, stay safe out there. Here's some tips. And one of them was avoid, it kind of was out of left field. Like it didn't really fit in with, and then one of them was avoid homes with Trump signs in the yard. And so she's saying, like in her mind, like, yeah, because, my people go up there and then some guy comes out with his shotgun and says, yeah, I know you're, leading the spearhead of the UN blue helmets coming in and taking over and sending us to FEMA camps. So get out of here because I listen to Alex Jones. And so she's saying there's no reason to risk interacting with somebody like that. Move on. There's plenty of people we can help. Like that's kind of how she was saying explaining her memo.
This is her story now. And I haven't seen any news come out of that area of Florida regarding these interactions, which is different than what we heard in Tennessee, which is, in some places, I think the FEMA responders were being given a hard time by some of the people who lived there. So this is not to say that there were no negative interactions, but if I have to take a look at the nature of the training that FEMA is giving over to their people, the fact that, in terms of their DEI approach, they certainly are seeking to exclude, right, people who might look like your typical Trump supporter. It is very difficult for me because again, there's a backstory here, right? I have seen FEMA unfold this effort to change their workforce over 2 decades. So there's more of a backstory here as well, and we can talk about that. But I am not inclined to buy completely that their policy of kind of avoiding homeowners simply because of a couple of negative interactions would be the only reason why they would completely avoid homes that are kind of marked with Trump signage. I don't buy the whole story. What I do buy is this lady coming forward and saying that this is not unique to her. This is other places, and it is instruction they are receiving from the top.
Okay, great. And with all this stuff too, I think probably in practice, it's all of the above that, like, just to completely change it, when we sit there and wonder, you hear all these stories, allegations from Republicans about like, oh, look at all the vote tamper, they had mail-in ballots that they had and they were deploying, around to different things and you hear that and you're, geez, would they be? But if you literally thought the next Hitler was about to be installed and end democracy, you wouldn't be willing to forge some mail-in ballots. You know what I mean? Like it's this sort of disconnect that on the one hand saying it's Hitler, but none of our people would ever cheat at the ballot box. I was like, well, why not? Don't you want to save us from Hitler? So anyway, with this, that yeah, if you're saying over time, and I would like to explore that more, that the workforce has been built up more and more, and if they have this notion in their head about what a Trump supporter is,
Yes.
I could understand why they would like genuinely, like earnestly believe, yeah, I don't want to go up there because that's rolling the dice. I might get shot or something. These crazy Trump supporters, let's go down, let's skip that house, even though on paper, like, no, you're not supposed to do that. Just like changing ballots or whatever would be wrong, whether or not you actually thought Trump was the next Hitler.
Yeah.
Okay, so, I mean, what about this? So I like how you did address, I was going to bring up if you hadn't volunteered it, the defense of that administrator that I saw, even from pro-Trump people saying, hey, in fairness, if you look at that memo in context, it looks like she's just trying to avoid altercations. And then just more generally, I have heard people say, yeah, the stuff about, FEMA will lock down a disaster site and stop people trying to go in with bottled water and whatever. And they're saying they're doing that for their own protection, that if there's down power lines or whatever it might be, homes that might collapse at any moment. The last thing you want if you're trying to provide aid is a bunch of, vigilante cowboys coming in trying to help, and then they get hurt, and then you got to go rescue them too. And so I've seen people make that sort of argument. So do you want to address that perhaps?
Yeah, I can say it is standard practice from an emergency management perspective at every level of government that if there is an area deemed unsafe by your local safety bureaucrats, like your code enforcement guys or your cops or your people who are looking around and doing that initial damage assessment, they do work to keep homeowners and business owners out of the area. And I don't think they do a very good job of saying, there are like 2 or 3 structures that are absolutely unsafe. Maybe you want to avoid these versus just cordoning off an entire street, for example. I don't think they do a very good job of that. I think that the homeowner, the business owner, is largely kept off of their property and not permitted to make that risk versus reward decision, which is critical in terms of obtaining your personal items, or critical in terms of being able to, get back to business for a small business owner who may be able to have supplies and resources for his or her community members. So that absolutely happens. We also know that during Hurricane Katrina, there was, they weren't setting up roadblocks for the private sector attempting to bring in truckloads of water, but there was a inability to properly coordinate with the private sector, and I think that that absolutely in Katrina resulted in kind of 2 things. It resulted in the inability to properly evacuate. I know I've said this a couple of times, but Bob, do you remember the picture of the buses in flooding? They're sitting in floodwaters in New Orleans. Those were supposed to be, it's like a famous picture. Those were supposed to be used for evacuation. There was a contract in place, and the people who were executing on that contract were unable to just even manifest a phone call to get them out of the way in time to be able to evacuate people. And then coming into New Orleans, we know that there was just an inability for the kind of the bureaucracy to properly coordinate with businesses like Walmart, for example, to get in the much needed supplies to places where they were sheltering. They were sheltering folks. So it is not uncommon for, I think the message coming out of Appalachia was really concerning, right? There are blockades. There are people taking supplies. And I would be less convinced that was going on if we didn't see footage kind of with our own eyes of, for example, I think there was like a fire chief telling people, nope, the feds told me to cordon this area off. You're not coming through. So they even, and this really gets at the topic of my dissertation, right? The federal government is very good at incentivizing local bureaucrats to do their bidding when it comes time. They've been handing money to the local governments to execute on homeland security matters, hand over fist for a long time now, since about 2004. So the local bureaucrats, sometimes your fire chief, your police chief, your emergency manager, a lot of these guys are really bought off by the feds and they're willing to just kind of implement whatever the federal government asks them to do. But
so if I stop you right there, just
Yes.
to quickly insert my silly anecdote, but I think I became a man in grad school on this point because I was in grad school, I was at NYU, and it was in Greenwich Village. And so my first semester there, I was in the NYU housing, which was right there. And so these were enormous apartment complexes, housing, I don't know, at least, let's say probably 1,000 tenants in my one building alone. And it was, real, like a city block wide. And I don't even know if it was literally a fire or just a concern, but there were, it was somewhere in this vast building. And I was coming back from like the gym or something. I had to run up to my room to get my stuff to go to class. And there were like, I don't know, 15 vehicles just blocking the whole street off, big trucks, little fire engine, like every fire engine vehicle you could imagine was there. Just dozens and dozens of firefighters just standing around doing nothing. And so I go into the lobby of my building and I'm trying to, go to the elevator to go up to my room and get my notes or whatever for class. And the fire guys look at me and they're just like, no, you can't go up. And they're looking at me like, what are you, an idiot? And I was like, oh, okay, safety first. And then I backed away and I went into the stairwell and just walked up to my room because wherever the thing was, it was like way far away. You know what I mean? It's not like there was smoke and I was like, no, I gotta go get my notes. That wasn't it at all. Everyone was standing around. There was no emergency. They were lounging around talking. And so I went up to my room to get my notes and my roommate was sound asleep in bed. And so to me, that kind of showed that, I don't think that really it was just, no, as a policy, you can't use the elevator, you idiot, just, they didn't say go use the stairs. Like they didn't say, oh, why do you need to go to your room? They just said, no, we've locked down the building, get out of here, you idiot. And I decided, no, I don't think that actually, I think me going to class is more important than waiting around for these guys to give the all clear when there's somebody's smoke alarm went off, 300 yards down the building length. So anyway, I did not die. And my roommate, who was sound asleep the whole time and was not evacuated, also did not die that day. But anyway, that to me kind of just underscored that, like when you're little and you just, like if there's a fire, like the fire people come in and shut things down because they want to make sure everyone's safe. But yet in practice, it was clear these guys wanted to jump in the vehicle and drive down and get out of the firehouse that day because that was more, you know what I mean? Like there was no reason 18 or whatever vehicles showed up for this thing. Anyway, I'm done ranting, but so you're saying that, it's the local authorities who kind of have the power to do that, but then FEMA incentivizes them to lock down and kind of take cues from Washington because there's a flow of money?
Yeah, so, I mean, your example is a perfect one because it demonstrates the lack of incentive, right? There's no incentive to remediate the issue quickly. Clearly no incentive to evacuate, so it wasn't that bad. They're really operating on a scenario where they don't need to do it quickly. They don't even necessarily need to do it well. They simply need to do it and check the box. And this is not to say there aren't awesome firefighters who are doing a great job, but largely the bureaucracies that they work for aren't properly incentivized to do anything in an exemplary fashion. So, I think that's that's about a perfect example.
Okay, great. So you brought up Katrina, and I think a lot of us in the libertarian world really had our eyes open. And so, I distinctly remember because I wrote up a piece at the time documenting some of this stuff. And there were Walmart officials saying that, we were trying to send just, truckloads of, canned goods and bottled water, and the feds would not let us through. So if you're saying nuance, it's more like we tried to coordinate and they said, hang on, we'll get back to you. And they never did. Maybe it was something more like that as opposed to literally there was some cop not letting them pass. But definitely I saw stuff that I believed was a credible source that Walmart itself was trying to send tons of aid and it was not getting to the intended beneficiaries because of government decisions.
Yeah. Being a physical blockade, whether it be a physical blockade or a communications breakdown, both are kind of an indication of a centralizing emergency management bureaucracy that is unconcerned with kind of best use of resources and really unconcerned with whether or not the response is efficient. And I think we're seeing an extension of that now under Chris Well's leadership too.
So maybe if we just take a step back, what's interesting is I can understand a normal person if they hear like a Rothbardian take on, we should privatize police and judicial services and military defense, that sounds insane. And no, that's the government has to do that. But when it comes to FEMA, and you're saying their explicit job is more about let's foster coordination and cooperation and communication of incentives and signals and and make sure we don't have redundancy and make sure. That sounds like the last thing in the world I would want the government to be in charge of. And so, I mean, I don't know, maybe can you just speak to that, but then also what would happen in the absence of that? Like, well, gee, how could it be if you've got all these church groups and state and local officials and everyone, and there's a natural disaster and everyone wants to help. If you didn't have FEMA in there kind of directing traffic, what would happen?
Yeah. So it's not so crazy to think about privatization. For some of the functions, like there are privatized fire departments. This was a thing out in Arizona a number of years ago. I don't know how many of them still operate, but a number of privatized fire departments. There are public safety answering points or 911 centers that are privatized. Certainly security is without question a thing that we know can be privatized and done well. So it's not crazy to think about disaster response, things like debris management after a storm, that these things can be privatized and taken on by communities as opposed to kind of funded and dictated how it's going to happen by the federal government. So, again, 100 years ago, it was the states and charities and churches managing disasters. The need for FEMA is not something that I'm necessarily willing to stand by. I think that the money and the function can be returned to state governments. State governments do a really good job of working with each other, even in the absence of FEMA. There's an emergency management assistance compact that the states sign on to, and they agree to share resources. They even agree, we used to send teams. We were in Maryland and we would send teams to down south if there was a hurricane. So states work really well together. I don't know that the intervention that occurs on behalf of FEMA is a necessity, but for as long as FEMA must be around, and I suspect it's not going anywhere, it really needs to shed its adoption of these liberal pet causes of equity and climate change, and really refocus on that need for coordination. You cited Katrina. I think we can also go back even further and look at something like a 9/11. The 9/11 report bears out the same thing that we hear in every after action report from every large disaster, and that's that communications capabilities are terrible. And so I think, again, that coordination that is both kind of acute and on scene and needs to happen quickly, as well as that administrative coordination. These are things that FEMA can help facilitate and support state and local governments in. But as it stands right now, and certainly more increasingly after September 11th, they have centralized. They are now primarily responsible for paying for even staffing a local emergency management office. These are not things, the local jurisdiction should be able to determine their level of priority for having staff members handling emergency management. The federal government does not need to fund some guy sitting in an emergency management shop taking his online equity classes. It's just unnecessary.
Yep. You mentioned 9/11, and so I have to tell another anecdote. So I was in I was still at NYU, attending NYU, but I was living in Jersey City at the time. So I actually saw the second tower go down, looking out my window. I watched it in real time. My roommate worked in the financial sector or district at the time. And so he had taken the train into the World Trade Center, coming from Jersey and connecting on the path or whatever. And so the first one had hit already, and when he pulled in, so that people were in the aftermath of the first plane hitting, and everyone just thought it was a freak accident. Holy cow, pilot just had a heart attack or something, hit the World Trade Center. And he was walking outside and looking up when the second plane hit. And so he started running and actually had debris, hit him on the back as he was running away. So he went into a building, a nearby building, and he said, I think it was a cop, was hurting everybody in the lobby of this building. People are freaking out, obviously, at this point. And they said, come on, everyone calm down. Nope, just stay in here. It's safe in here. Just da. And then he said he looked at this lady next to him and she said, I don't want to stay here. And he said, yeah, me neither. And they kind of slunk away and then went out a side door and just started taking off. And then the tower started coming down. And so, again, just showing that just because someone's got a badge or whatever and is telling you this is the protocol, maybe trust your gut, and then no, if you think something's unsafe, maybe you want to act on that what they're telling you to do is and another example too, a different, when my son was young, he was telling me about the active shooter drills they were doing at his school. And to me, I won't get into specifics, but it just sounded like, yeah, if you want to make sure every single person dies, do what they just said. And I said to him, no, you see you run. And then if don't worry about getting in trouble from your teacher, I'll deal with that. In other words, what he was telling me they said to do just sounded insane to me. So anyway, I'm kind of rambling at this point, but I'll stop there. Any thoughts on my various anecdotes?
Yeah. So I think there is something that happens. There is something that happens to a person when they, as you said, get the badge. Mm-hmm. There is something to be said for, especially, it seems like it happened to you on 9/11 or your friend on 9/11, but I saw a lot after 9/11. There is this othering of people who are like, the civilians, right? There's people who do not have a badge and who do not have kind of the power and knowledge of what are we really going to do about terrorism? We've got all these civilians running around. Al-Qaeda could be among them. I think there really is like this self-importance, this othering of your community members who maybe don't wear the badge, this sense that people are something to be managed as opposed to competent people who can be resources in a disaster, who have better local knowledge. I mean, I think there is a thing that happens to a person when they go to work for government. I can tell you in my own stories, I went into emergency management not long after 9/11. And I remember the conversations around me, we're going to have to herd these sheep, this kind of thing. And it took me probably about, just about 10 years. You wouldn't think it would take that long, right? But I was not a libertarian then. And I finally looked around and this is crazy how we treat people. Mm-hmm. How we think about them as something to be managed and not resources, how there really is this othering of kind of the community member, the civilian versus a person who is wearing a badge. There is something to be said for what happens to a person when they go to work for government. And I don't care at what level that occurs. And it's not to say there are not fine people who work for local government. There certainly are. But I do think there is kind of a militarized mentality in public safety that really took root after 9/11. And it really took root because everybody was getting cool guy equipment. And everybody got a drone. Everybody got a Bearcat. And I think there was really just this domestic war on terror mentality that took hold. And I think it exists to today. But it exists alongside a focus on equity and climate change, which is a really interesting combination of kind of a potent combination of things to have your public safety community concerned about.
Well, yeah, you're reminding me, you're saying this mindset of like, oh yeah, there's the public and they're just sheep that need to be herded, and oh yes, and they've got their wacky views and stuff, but we're the experts. No, it's similar to like how during COVID, this phrase like, oh, he did his own research, like became a slur or something, and I even remember when that thing happened at NYU when I said like I encountered the firefighters and, just kind of said, okay, and then backed away and went up the stairwell and saw my roommate was sound asleep. I wrote that up in a piece for LouRockwell.com at the time. And I had some like retired firefighters emailing me and chewing me out like, no, you don't understand the situation. And yeah, civilians think that they know it's safe, but no, it's not. And we got training and no acknowledgement of, yeah, in this particular case, you didn't die from, smoke inhalation, but you got lucky, like nothing, just complete. No, the firefighters were right. If they told you, you should just leave the building, you should have just listened to them. When I was like, no, I was there and I don't think there was any danger to me whatsoever. And especially, like I said, then why did they get my roommate out of the room? But anyway, so I think you're right that there is this mentality that does permeate. And again, like you said too, obviously other things equal, guys who run into burning buildings to rescue people, like that's cool. I'm not saying of all types of government employees, fire, and as you say, some can be private anyway. It's not just a government private thing. That's admirable. I'm not denying that, but I'm just saying what I saw. It's my lived experience, Amy. That's what I'm talking about.
It's your lived experience. And it's mine too. That, I heard these conversations. I took part in them as well. And now looking back, a person, a citizen is something to, that could be a resource, could be valued, and that certainly makes a better risk versus reward calculation than a bureaucrat.
So Can you maybe speak to, because I think what happens a lot of times when it comes to stuff like airline regulation, just to completely switch topics, I think people have this notion that, oh yeah, the FAA, maybe they're not perfect. Of course they're not. People are, but you have this baseline level of what the safety would be, and then the FAA comes in and just clearly has to make airlines safer than they otherwise would be. And so why wouldn't you want things to be safer? And so I would go through and say, well, no, because that's kind of short-circuiting what the private alternative would have been. And so if they're doing a bad job and then there's a crash because the FAA inspectors were overworked or whatever, it's not clear. It's not merely helping that it can, if it supplants what the private sector alternative would have been, then maybe it's actually making airline travel more dangerous. And so likewise here, if someone's hearing you and just saying, okay, Amy, but FEMA can only help, right? And so why wouldn't you just want more assistance given to people and give more? Isn't more coordination better than less coordination and more money? So what would you say to somebody like that thinks at worst FEMA is just wasting tax dollars? It's not that they're actually impeding assistance in a disaster situation.
I have two things to say about that. The first is that in 2022, the GAO released a report that said that FEMA managers were, when surveyed, answering that their personnel, when they were sending them out to do their jobs in disaster areas, completely unqualified. So FEMA's hiring people who don't even know what they're doing. And that type of a person put in a position of authority, permitted to make the decisions like the ones we're talking about. Yes, you are or you aren't allowed to go back into your home or your business. Yes, it is or it isn't safe to go into that building. The caliber of person FEMA is hiring is such that their managers were complaining about them in the GAO report, right? They're completely unqualified. So right out of the gate, right? I don't think we're hiring the most qualified people to be able to make those decisions. And if we're hiring them based on things other than merit, as occurs under kind of a DEI hiring system, that calls into question their capabilities as well. But what I would tell them is a story about something called the National Flood Insurance Program that is housed under FEMA. And in terms of, the way I want to answer your question is with how does FEMA make it worse?
Okay, yeah, great.
Because I don't think there are a whole lot of instances where they make it better. But one of the most concerning programs at FEMA is the National Flood Insurance Program. And this is a program that subsidizes flood insurance, so brings the cost down for homeowners living in high hazard areas. So this gives an uneven kind of picture to the homeowner of what their risk actually is, as opposed to that insurance being completely improperly on the free market. So with the NFIP, homeowners who could not maybe otherwise afford their homes because of the drastic increase on the open market, as you would imagine, for living on living on the ocean, right? You live kind of right on the beach. There has been, so say, for example, you live in an area that is hurricane prone, that has seen storm surge in the past. Maybe, if you are kind of in a flood designation area, there has historically been floods. On the proper open market, the insurance for that would be astronomical, right? But would bear the burden by the insurance, it would bear the anticipated burden by the insurance company to have to remediate or replace that home. FEMA, through the NFIP, subsidizes those rates. So we are moving people into high hazard areas without a proper understanding of what their risk actually is, because they're not bearing the full cost. And this is one example of crazy things that FEMA does. There is a whole kind of subset of hazard mitigation programs as well, where they just go around and they buy people storm shutters. And there's just really just this craziness, things that FEMA has absolutely no business doing and inserting itself. And in doing so, really removes kind of the impetus from the homeowner, from insurance companies, just kind of drives down our understanding of what the risk actually is. And it's only one example, but it's a pretty clear one.
Okay, great. Yeah. And it even just more generally too, this notion that FEMA just has extra money that, no, as you say, if they just were disbanded and federal taxes were reduced, then the states would have more money, at least on average. And so by everyone's sending their money to Washington to then get it dispersed back when there's an emergency. That's not making every U.S. citizen wealthier. In fact, it's making it worse, because now you got to pay for the overhead of FEMA's personnel too.
Yeah, and it means that the risk is not distributed. Minnesota doesn't have the same risk as coastal Florida, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not even, there's not even a proper calculation for who should bear the risk. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
So can I ask, just thinking back like to your doctoral dissertation and so on, is there anything that came up in your original research that we haven't touched on yet that you think is an important point on this topic?
No, I would just say my primary concern, early on in my research was what are the local the guy in the county in his local shop, what is a local emergency manager going to do with these millions of Homeland Security dollars coming from grant funds? Like there's a state Homeland Security grant program and emergency management performance grant program. I mean, the number of grant programs is just off the charts. What's this guy going to do with these millions and millions of dollars? And from my own experience, I can tell you, I worked in a very small county, and we were, in the years that followed September 11th, with the inception of the State Homeland Security Grant Program, receiving just about $500,000 to just spend on, domestic war on terrorism stuff. And I wondered if that relationship between the federal government and the local government, if that would really drive local emergency managers to act in the best interest of the federal government. And overwhelmingly, they responded that they wouldn't even be there if the feds weren't paying for their shops anymore because they were not a local priority. And they agreed, overwhelmingly, like in a nationwide study, they agreed that they were beholden to carry out federal dictates, do federal paperwork, and kind of just generally be prepared to do what the federal government needed them to do. Instead of handling local priorities. So they were doing the bidding of the federal government as opposed to being out in their communities, properly thinking about evacuation, shelter, kind of medical care for shelters. They were exempting these things in favor of doing whatever the federal government was asking them to do.
Okay. All right. That makes a lot of sense. Maybe I'm just looking at the clock here. Maybe one more question. And I understand, Amy, that you're probably treading a fine line where a lot of the people who enjoy your material have probably low opinions of the federal government, but on the other hand, you do have this, this background and you're respectable. But I have to ask, one of the things floating around, our circles is the idea that, oh yeah, there's these plans to build FEMA camps. And when the time is right, they're going to drop the hammer and maybe use some pretext like, Corona 2 or monkeypox or whatever, or, nuclear war, who knows what. And they're going to take all the people that have been trashing, the Democrats on Twitter, and they're all going to round them up and put them in the FEMA camp. How would you like to respond to that?
I have to say that I have seen no evidence of FEMA camps being built, but there's always a little tiny bit of truth to some of these conspiracies. There is there is kind of a mentality at FEMA that that we have already discussed, but I don't think I have seen any evidence of the construction of FEMA camps, but you'll be the first to know if I come across it.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Because joking aside, Amy, I have seen people try to explain it and say, well, yeah, they have contingency. Like, wouldn't you want them to? What if there is, some super bug that comes out? Like, wouldn't they need to be able to quarantine people? And you libertarians would be complaining if they weren't ready for that. Like, so you have this whole organization set up and you didn't even do a, troubleshooting and what would happen? So anyway, I've just seen the spectrum of saying, no, there's no such thing, all the way to, yes, there is such a thing and it's good.
Yeah. So there's no, in terms of the way people have talked about FEMA camps, whole sects of political views being rounded up. Right. I have not seen any evidence of that, but there absolutely are mass casualty plans. There's no doubt about that. There has been pandemic planning in place since the early 2000s as well, if not before. I participated in some of that as early as 2004. That is absolutely the case. There are those types of plans, but this kind of conspiracy about FEMA setting up camps and being prepared to round us up any second, there's not a whole lot of legitimacy to that piece of it.
All right. Because I just want to make sure I have the bottom bunk because I have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. And so I want to not have to keep climbing up and down when they do send me to the camp. And I would be kind of upset if they didn't. I'm thinking, don't you guys know who I am?
It's good to think ahead.
Yes, it is. I'm preparing for the disaster in my own personal life. Okay, well, my guest, folks, this week has been Amy LePore. Amy, thanks for your research and just spreading the message and educating people about the what is and is not true about FEMA.
Thanks for having me on, Bob.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.